So we are fortunate to have Elizabeth Glidden here. I first met Elizabeth years ago when we had a chance to go on an international trip to see a ranked choice voting election in practice. There actually are a lot of ranked choice voting elections done around the world. It's an increasingly common system for that same reason, that it just is a good, seemed to be a good way to accommodate voter choice. But she has been she was first elected before the city had ranked choice voting, was part of the process where it was put on the ballot. It was passed in 2006. The implementation issues that everyone has had to deal with after passing it, she was part of that. She's running it. She has observed campaigns and had a window seat, particularly to the 2013 election. So we're really fortunate to have her here.
My name is Elizabeth Glidden, and I am a member of the Minneapolis City Council. I'm really happy to be here with you, sharing a little bit of what I guess I would call the Minneapolis story, and I'm really interested to see what kind of questions and dialogue that we can have, because I think this is a little bit of a conversation, as many cities are in similar places of maybe going through their first or their second election using ranked choice voting, and how can we learn from each other to help candidates and help the public understand the system and make the most out of it. I was elected in 2005, and it was shortly after that we had a pretty robust petition process in the city of Minneapolis, very grassroots driven, to put ranked choice voting on the ballot. And we ended up as a city council actually taking a little bit of control of that process to make sure we had the question framed properly on the ballot to the best advantage of how it would be particularized in our city charter. And again, kind of similarly to Oakland, it passed very robustly with over 2/3 of the vote. So this was something that the voters in Minneapolis said that they wanted. And it was really exciting to be part of that campaign and part of that atmosphere of talking to voters about why does this matter to you, why do you want this system that we're calling ranked choice voting. And so I thought I might mention just a couple things about the state of Minnesota and Minneapolis, just to say a little bit of what was the political environment that I think was supporting this change. Some of the reasons I think are kind of similar to other cities. We had very low turnout in our primaries in city elections, just, that I think is a repeat theme that we see around the country. And for many of us, and for me in particular, I just thought that was a wrong process, that you had this very slender, slim amount of people of a certain demographic that were narrowing the choices to two, and only at that point in time did the broader part of the electorate participate in the choice of who was going to represent them at the city council, in the mayor's office. So this was a big part of the theme. There was another part of the theme, though, that was about third parties. So I don't know what kind of a role third parties play here in Oakland, but in Minneapolis, we have had third parties and have a third party candidate on the ballot, or not on the ballot, but on the city council. We have a Green council member. In the recent past, we've had 2 Green council members and an Independence Party council member. It's been a while since we've had a Republican council member, but it has happened. And in the state, we also have a really robust third-party system. So this actually was a big part of the theme of why I think people in Minneapolis saw this as important, because I think it's been over 2 decades, well over 2 decades, since we have elected a governor in the state of Minnesota with 50% of the vote. We haven't done it. So we have had all of our governors for I think the past 4 elections at least have been elected with less than 50% of the vote. And we've had a lot of very strong, robust third-party candidates. The most high-profile one was Jesse Ventura, but he is not the only high-profile Independence Party candidate. So this has changed elections in the state of Minnesota, and so this idea of wanting to elect someone who really could show they had a majority of the votes supporting them was a big part of the theme of why this, I think, gained traction in the city of Minneapolis. Hang on just a second, I'm getting back into my iPad here. All right. So we first implemented ranked choice voting in our 2009 elections. And in the city of Minneapolis, the offices that are on the ballot include the mayor. We have 13 council members. We also have something called the Board of Estimate and Taxation, which I don't know if you even need to worry about that. We're, I think, the only city that has something like that. But then we also have an elected park board, and within that elected park board, we have at-large candidates, and then we have district candidates. We have a lot of different offices on the ballot at one time. And we vote on everything in 1 year. So our elections are 4 years apart. And so in 2009, every single office was on the ballot. And I will say that leading up to having those offices on the ballot and thinking about how we would do an election in the city of Minneapolis was very challenging. At that time, we did not have any automated solutions for counting ballots. And so, and I was just meeting with some elections officials before this meeting, and they were amazed to know about our hand count process that we used in the city of Minneapolis. But we used a hand count. As you can imagine, this was something that was pretty scary. We also were very concerned about how long would the hand count take, so that how long would then voters wait for those election results, and how would that then influence how they thought about ranked choice voting. In the end, we had an election that was a pretty low profile election. In 2009, there was not a lot of political drama, so to speak. We had a very popular mayor who was running for re-election with no real challengers. We also really didn't have hardly any change on the city council. So these were low-profile races. As a whole, the city had low voter turnout, as you might imagine, in a year where there just was not a lot of political movement. It took us 15 days to do the hand count, totally do the hand count, but many of the races were able to be called in the first few days, and I think that also helped with just what was the dialogue about how well did the election go. We contracted for some independent reports of those 2009 elections and really felt that we had good results, that voters understood how to rank. They participated and felt that the ballot was easy to use, and that we had a low rate of what you might call spoilage of ballots. It was a non-story year, which I guess in the sense of how the election went was really a good story year. We did not have a story about how things fell apart and how ranked choice voting didn't work. I think the biggest disappointment was just that there wasn't a lot of political activity. But boy, did that change in 2013. So 2013, our very popular mayor, R.T. Ryback, decided that he was not going to run for re-election. So we have an open seat. And due also to the fact it was an open seat and that we also had not changed the municipal filing fee for mayor in a really long time. We had, I think, $20 fee to file for mayor. We had 35 candidates that ended up filing and getting on the ballot. And, 35 candidates, yes, but there was also a very large field of what you might call real candidates who had support, who were raising money, who had coalitions that supported them, who were out there for a reason other than just wanting to put their name on the ballot. And we probably had about 7 or 8 candidates that I would say was in that category. So we had a very robust list of candidates. We also, interestingly, had a lot of very competitive city council races. And that, I think, also played into the dynamic of how would ranked choice voting affect not only this mayor's race, but all of these city council races. To kind of give you a flavor of how much change, we have 13 members on the city council. After election day, 7 of those council members were new. And I think in the history of Minneapolis, we've only had one other time in our history when we have had that much turnover on the Minneapolis City Council. So a lot of change was happening in the city of Minneapolis. Some of those races for the council were what we call open seats, but some of them were challenges to incumbents. And there were 3 races where incumbents were knocked off, did not win their races, and these were very competitive races. So that was the environment in the city of Minneapolis. One of the things that I've heard as questions is, when you have such a big field and there isn't a primary to cull that field at whatever that point in time is, what does that do to the race? How do you differentiate yourself? And then how also are you thinking about how do you appeal and win in that ranked choice voting environment? In a sense, I think there are a lot of things that are just very similar to what happens in a traditional race. You want to be the person who is able to show your support by raising a fair amount of money. That's one way that you show support. You need to raise enough money that you can reach voters in all the ways that you want to reach those voters. You want to go out and you want to get as much support, endorsement, coalition building, whatever that looks like, as you can. That is no different in your ranked choice voting election as it is in your traditional election. When I ran as a candidate in 2005 in a traditional election, I actually had a field of 10 candidates, and there was that same kind of environment of how do you break free of these 10 candidates even as you're trying to reach that primary. So I think that environment still happens in traditional elections, although you have the primary as another point in time. So I think it's also about how do you differentiate yourself, because it is unusual, I think, that you differentiate yourself in a debate. Often, I think debates are a hard time to differentiate yourself. It can happen, but I think sometimes those are unusual moments. So it ends up being, how do you make news about yourself? How do you react when events happen around you and rise to the occasion? It's kind of interesting that we did have in this 35 candidate race, we had one, what I would call pretty high profile Republican candidate. He probably did the most of anyone else to make news. He would do things like he did a press conference on a bus one time where he was trying to advocate that buses were a better form of transportation than streetcars, which is a bit of a debate in the city of Minneapolis. So just as an example of that. But I think there were some differences in the candidates that played well to who won the election and why that played well in a ranked choice voting environment. So the candidate that won, her name is Betsy Hodges, and she was on the city council, so she and I served together for 8 years on the city council. As we drew towards the end of the election, it became clear, while I would say there were probably a smaller list of maybe 5 candidates that had raised a substantial amount of money and had different amounts of support, that there were really 2 candidates that had shown themselves to have raised enough money to reach voters in a big city, and were also showing that they had built broad coalitions around them. I think those coalitions looked a little bit different, and that may be part of the story. So I'm going to talk about that a little bit. I think the strategies of those 2 top candidates were a little bit different, and I think that tells part of the story as well. And then the third thing is I think the message from those 2 candidates was a little bit different. I think that was part of the story as well. Let me talk first about the strategy. The top 2 candidates, again, the winner was a woman named Betsy Hodges, but the other top candidate who actually raised more money than she did was a man who was sort of resurrected. He had been elected many years ago, was a very popular politician who had then gone back into the private sector, and his name was Mark Andrew. And the coalitions that ended up being built around these 2 candidates, they just looked different. Both of the candidates had, as an example, labor support is very important in the city of Minneapolis. We are what we call a DFL, Democratic Farmer Laborer Town. That's what we call our Democrat Party in Minneapolis. Betsy Hodges had the support of what I would characterize as the most vibrant growing union in the city of Minneapolis, which is SEIU. So the Mark Andrew did have substantial labor support, but I think it was that more traditional building and trades type of support. So the type of coalitions that kind of grew out of those 2 different types of support really looked different. Betsy Hodges, another difference I'm going to talk about with her strategy is that she had been very involved the year before in a ballot measure for the state of Minnesota that was about marriage equality. And so in Minnesota, that story was about defeating a ballot measure which would have restricted marriage to one man, one woman. And Betsy was very involved in that campaign, and she had a lot of the strategists from that campaign were on her mayoral campaign. And the strategy of this campaign to defeat the marriage ballot measure was about going really deep and wide. It was about finding those voters who might not necessarily vote and finding ways to reach them and tell them their vote was really important. So the people that she had advising her campaign, this was their mindset. And this was their experience from just the year before of unique tactics to go and reach really widely and really deeply. And I think when you compare that strategy to what I think is a little bit more of a traditional campaign strategy and kind of the first past the post, which I would say is often a little bit more about strategic targeting and how to get those voters who election after election after election are most likely to vote. How you contrast those strategies, because in the end it's going to be about how you turn out more voters who are going to vote for you first, second, and third choices. And for Betsy Hodges, and I wasn't inside her campaign, so I want to just say there's probably more lessons to be learned from her own campaign manager about how that worked. But I think that's a story of what played out with her campaign, because when you looked at her election results, she is the person who more people ranked and gave her first, second, and third choices. She did end up having the most first choices, but it wasn't enough for her to win. She had to go into additional rounds of voting for that to work. Let me say, I guess my last point was about platform and message. So again, a lot of these top candidates in the city of Minneapolis, I would say there are very similar themes in their platforms. I mean, you're not talking about really major policy differences in these candidates. They're coming from similar places. They're trying more to sell you on how they would govern, what's the skills they're bringing to the table, and those kinds of things. But Betsy, more than any other candidate, really was out front, was saying, I'm a progressive candidate. I'm going to work on racial equity as my #1 issue for the city of Minneapolis, and her theme was talking about one Minneapolis. And she, other candidates use those themes. They might not have used those same words, but use those same themes. But I think she was the candidate who was most out front, was saying, this is who I am, and really strongly selling that message. And again, I think that showed in who turned out and who voted for her. So those are just some thoughts I have on what I thought were some things that might have helped that candidate, because she didn't raise the most money. And she didn't have the most, what I would call, traditional support from kind of more the, what we often call the Democratic establishment. But she won. And I think no one questions that she won this election. She won this election. I wanted to say a couple words about voter education, and then maybe we can stop and take some questions and delve more into this, because I haven't really talked that much about the city council races, and that was kind of an interesting thing that I think also influenced what happened in the mayor's races, because of course these robust, vigorous city council races were themselves driving turnout and participation in their own ways. The voter education was something where the city of Minneapolis really made a conscious decision. We want to invest in voter education. We had invested in voter education in our 2009 election, but again, it had been 4 years since that election, 4 years since voters had experienced ranked choice voting, and we knew it was going to be very important to repeat those messages, and because of how competitive the election was, to augment those messages. So the city of Minneapolis And I will say too, we don't traditionally in the city of Minneapolis, we have not traditionally invested in voter education. So again, I don't know how those things happen here, but in Minneapolis, we have not traditionally had a budget for voter outreach in our traditional elections. We have relied on candidates and outside organizations to do that kind of work. So some of the things that we invested in were we did, I think, a very well-designed direct mail piece that had a sample ballot. I heard a lot of voters talk about how they thought that piece was effective and really helped them understand right before the election what would that ballot look like. We also, though, invested in some more technology-savvy strategies. We had a new website which you can find today that I think is much more simple to use and utilize. And if you just Google "Vote Minneapolis," you'll go right to that website and kind of see the look and feel of that. We had some social media tools that we were trying to more robustly use, and we had some, I think, good videos that were used and then were shared on social media and in other ways. And we did a lot of meetings from City of Minneapolis staff with groups across the city targeting a lot of those precincts that have had traditionally low voter turnout. So we very intentionally tried from the City of Minneapolis to find ways to spread a message about what is ranked choice voting, how do you fill out the ballot, but also what does it mean to vote in a ranked choice voting election? What's the importance of ranking? How will that play out? What does that look like? So that was part of the messaging from the City of Minneapolis as well. In addition to that, we had a lot of outside organization support that I think took what we did in the City of Minneapolis and then helped us go really deep. We have a chapter of Fair Vote that is called Fair Vote Minnesota, and they really did an amazing amount of work raising money. They had canvases that were set up all across the city, again, a lot of them targeting areas of the city that had had low voter turnout so that you could really have that individual voter touch happening. And then they partnered with other organizations in the city that I think were able to reach into different areas of the city, into different faith organizations, into specific communities of color in ways that Fair Vote Minnesota may not themselves have been able to do. So that's a little bit of that picture. I think it was kind of an all hands on deck feel with wanting in this year. It had been a long time since we'd had an open race for mayor in the city of Minneapolis, and I think across the city we just felt this was an important opportunity for as many residents as possible to participate in this opportunity of selecting our next mayor. It's really important. So anyway, thank you very much. I probably went on way too long, but all right, thank you.